when you say localities, what exactly do you mean? Is it
That just kind of depends on what we're talking about. But I mean, right now, and you know, it can differ according to the way in which, you know, specific times and places. So in the case of Ireland, for example, there is a division which takes place within the 18th and 19th century between the industrial northeast of Ireland and, you know, the rest of the kind of peripheralized part of the island. We can think about the way in which those two parts of the island work together to create some kind of a local interaction with Britain and with the Atlantic economy in a larger context. We could also think about the northeast of Ireland as a distinct place which has a distinct kind of role within a division of labor, which is very much controlled from the center and from Britain, but which, in which the northeast of Ireland has some capacity, as Cardozo would say about Brazil, to kind of negotiate a better kind of deal. And certainly Belfast then emerges as a better place to be in certain kind of respects than, you know, the famine-ridden countryside of the rest of the island. So what we mean by locality kind of depends on the level at which we're looking. I mean, the unit of analysis that we have is the global one of the world system, which consists of a worldwide division of labor, a certain class structure which is worldwide, but this gets reproduced in various kind of local levels, whether we're talking about the nation state or usually regions within the nation state. Makes a lot more sense because different regions do different things. So Sao Paulo, for example, is very different from the jungle of the Amazon. And that's kind of the best I can do, is say that it just depends on our object or, you know, place and time. The other piece of this that I think is very important then is to think about the way that these kinds of processes work out into the way in which developmental states emerge. And for a period of time there was a long bit of work on developmental states. And that referred to the degree to which states did something which enabled developmental processes to take place, so that if we have these kinds of local bargains which are going on, wherein local classes and state actors are trying to make some kind of a more preferable bargain or negotiation with international forces, including international capital and strong states like the US or Britain or whatever. The state plays a very important role in doing that, and there's a lot of debates about the degree of autonomy that states have and so on and so forth, and we'll go into that. But I think that the more useful thing to do is just to mention a couple of ways in which people have kind of divided up the way in which states support the developmental process. One is Peter Evans' distinction between husbandry and midwifery, where he says that some developmental states become very fundamentally involved in the development process in the sense that they actually become involved in manipulating various kinds of economic instruments and policies and so on and so forth, you know, interest rates, foreign exchange rates. They give and take away opportunities for productive investment and so on and so forth. The Korean state would be seen as a very typical example of that kind of a husbanding state. Whereas the midwife, according to, forgive all this kind of crazy, you know, gender-related stuff, but the midwife state basically just brings the baby into existence. This, I think, a lot of people would see to be pretty much the role that the IDA and the Irish state played, and even more recently as things became even more neoliberal, that basically a set of parameters were set up which created the best environment for the emergence of and the possibility of foreign capital to invest in Ireland in a profitable kind of a way, and to reinvest, and then, you know, particularly in the 90s, to mushroom again as the kind of central piece of what happened in the Celtic Tiger. But the state is only kind of present at the birth. and does as little as possible in terms of actually manipulating what happens after. The whole idea, as was said early on in the case of the Irish development strategy, is that we try to be as little of a regulatory state as possible, because it's important that foreign capital knows that they can come in here, they can operate, move their capital in and out, move their profits in and out, and so on and so forth, with very little regulation from the state. We just try and make it as possible for them to, get this thing born as they can. And hopefully it will be born here on this island, and not in Britain, and not in Holland, or somewhere else. So that was, I think, a kind of important descriptive distinction about developmental states. There were a number of models then that have been put forward about how they work. One which I think has been very interesting and useful is Dieter Singas's book on the European experience, where he talks basically about developmental states in the mid to late 19th century, in small states in Europe, and the way in which they used various kinds of really import substituting and protective regimes in order to take advantage of niches that were then available in the European economy. So the example that we always hear about is Denmark, where the state was involved in helping local capital, in fact encouraging them and husbanding them to get involved in various kinds of industrial activities that were tied to the dairy and pork economies in Denmark. And then what came out of that was a kind of a more holistic industrial agrarian regime. And Singhaus says that in most cases of the successful development in small states in Europe in the late 19th century, that's kind of what happened. Is the state played this very strong role in encouraging and in some cases actually identifying and kind of pushing capitalists to do things. And that's a little bit similar to what happened in the Asian tigers as well, where the possibility for development was given by the fact that Japan had a model of upgrading in which they moved out of certain leading sectors and into new leading sectors. And as they moved forward, because the Japanese economy was as limited as it was, they provided opportunities for other economies to move up behind them. So people have talked about a flying geese where Japan is the lead goose, Korea and Taiwan are the geese behind, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia are behind that, and so on. See my Malaysian friend here. And the whole thing moves forward in a kind of this V path. That's seen as something I think most experts see as something which is very peculiar to the Asian model. Cardozo and Evans talk about large market states like Brazil and others, where the state have real advantages, particularly because they have big markets, and Volkswagen and IBM and etc. want to get in them to get access to the market. And then there's kind of the rest. And the rest, of which Ireland would be an example, find themselves jockeying and competing in whatever way possible in order to get the capital which is available. And of course, what happened in Ireland, as we very well know, which made the Celtic Tiger possible, is over a period of time really from the early 1950s until the 1990s, partly because of path dependency, because the Irish state was locked into an export-led industrialization policy, which was very dependent on foreign capital and foreign investment, and had few other options. Because of that, the IDA became very good and very efficient at being a midwife, basically. I mean, it advertised itself very well and made connections with different forms of capital, so that in the 1990s, when we had the reemergence of this huge outward movement of American capital, of course, here was Ireland, with a very advantageous position. to get it, so that Ireland began to get something like 40% of incoming high-tech capital investment into Europe. And this really was, if not one of the most important bases of the Celtic Tiger. So I'll not go into this too much, but I mean, in Ireland we have this specific experience, I think, which is very important about the way in which the developmental state comes about. And I'm not going into great detail into it, but I think to understand the Celtic Tiger, we need to go back and understand the role of import substitution in the 1930s and the way in which the kind of limitations of that model, of the nationalist economic development model, which really began in 1932, led to a series of limitations which put Ireland in a pretty vulnerable position after the Second World War, in which there were very few options. And the option, of course, which it took, and not just Ireland, but other countries in many different parts of the world took this option, was to make a transition away from import substituting industrialization and protection, and we all know the kind of story about how that happened, and to embark on an export-led industrialization model. And increasingly, but particularly in the 1970s, that became a very dependent one, because the degree to which industrial investment actually took place at different times was very dependent on the degree to which different external capitals were willing to invest in Ireland and for what reason they wanted to invest. And of course, in the 1990s, American capital really wanted to invest. And in particular, they wanted to invest in Ireland once Intel and some other key capitals invested, because it was a new investment pattern which was set up with a new kind of cycle of accumulation in which capitals were coming close together. I mean, you all know the story of flexible development and flexible accumulation and so on. And part of that was a new foreign investment model in which there was an agglomeration of capital. Ireland was very good at getting access to the capital that was going, and the Celtic Tiger was pretty much the result. So in this slide, again, I'll just go through that. I've already talked about the first three, but if there is a new thing called neoliberalization, or neoliberal globalization in the 80s and 90s, it's a regime in which there is, in fact, a very new pattern of investment and a new set of key and leading sectors, many of which clump or agglomerate their investments, and those investments, as we've seen from the early 1990s, become agglomerated in Ireland. And the result is the Celtic Tiger. So that, you know, as I mentioned before, it has 40% of the high-tech investments into Europe, into the European Union, with, what, 1.5% of the population, or something like that. I don't remember the precise figure. I've kind of been taken around by the Social Democrats for my sins in Germany, because they want to have some influence around Eastern Europe, where, of course, the Celtic Tiger had a very big impact, and basically there was a lot of preaching about the possibilities that were inherent in a neoliberal development model. And after 1989, basically, there was really strong sort of pressure for the East European economies, many of which are now accession or parts of the EU countries, to try and emulate the Irish model to become new Celtic Tigers. And of course, the very obvious elephant in the room, and this was always kind of the way I tried to describe it to them, was, well, there is only 100% of capital, of investment capital. If Ireland has 40% and Britain has 40% or 50%, there ain't no other 30 or 40% left to go. So for Poland, which has many times the population of Ireland, or for a Hungary or Czechoslovakia, the idea that you could base a development model on a massive influx of foreign investment by putting into